The captive who would not break. The cold metal walls of the Imperial Detention Center pulsed with an eerie blue glow, a design meant to instill unease in prisoners. The air was sterile, the silence heavy. Commander Zalvotek of the Galactic Empire stood outside the reinforced cell, his clawed hand resting lightly on the control panel. "She has not spoken?" he asked. "No, Commander," the interrogator replied, shifting uncomfortably. "She has not begged. She has not wept. She has not even flinched." Zalvotek's mandibles twitched in irritation. He had overseen the subjugation of countless species, watched mighty warriors crumble into sobbing husks beneath the Empire's boot. The human homeworld had fallen, its defenders either dead or enslaved. By all logic, this one, Evelyn Carter, former captain of the Resistance, should have been reduced to a pleading wreck. And yet, she was not. Zalvotek entered the cell. Evelyn sat on a metal bench, wrists bound behind her back, her face bruised but composed. Her brown eyes locked onto his, unblinking, unshaken. He expected fear. Instead, she studied him. "I assume you understand what position you're in," Zalvotek said at last. Evelyn smirked. "That's supposed to scare me?" Zalvotek's irritation deepened. "Your world is gone. Your people scattered. Your resistance is nothing but embers. And yet, you remain defiant. Why?" She tilted her head slightly, as if considering whether he was worth answering. "Because you expect me to be afraid." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Zalvotek had seen fear in every species the Empire conquered. It was the foundation of their rule. The moment a captive realized their situation was hopeless was the moment they surrendered completely. Yet this human refused to acknowledge that moment at all. "We will break you," he said, stepping closer. "All beings break. It is only a matter of time." Evelyn leaned forward as far as her restraints allowed. "No, you think fear is universal. That's your mistake." Zalvotek narrowed his eyes. "You are alone. You have no allies here." She smiled. "And yet, I'm the one you're afraid of." The temperature in the room felt colder, despite no change in the climate controls. Zalvotek straightened, dismissing the strange unease creeping into his mind. He turned to the interrogator. "Increase the frequency of questioning. Sleep deprivation. Psychological conditioning." Evelyn's voice stopped him at the doorway. "Won't work." Zalvotek turned back. "Why?" She shrugged. "Because fear is a choice." The door sealed shut between them, but the words lingered long after he left. 3 days passed. The methods used against Evelyn had broken warriors, rulers, even entire planetary leaders. Isolation, deprivation, mental assaults, each designed to unravel the psyche until nothing remained but submission. Yet, Evelyn Carter endured. She refused to scream. She refused to react. Even when left in darkness for hours, even when the machines filled her mind with false whispers of her people's annihilation, even when the guards sneered at her, expecting to see her resolve crack. Nothing. The silence of her resistance was louder than any scream. By the 4th day, some of the interrogators began refusing assignments to her cell. "She looks at me," one of them whispered to a colleague, voice shaking. "Not like prey, not like a prisoner. She looks like she knows something." Zalvotek reviewed the latest reports with growing unease. This was unnatural. A captive in her position must have, shown signs of breaking. He called for a direct meeting. Inside the cell, Evelyn sat as before, unchanged, unbroken. Zalvotek lowered himself to eye level. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "This is not courage, it is madness. What hope do you have left?" Evelyn chuckled softly. "Hope? You misunderstand." She leaned closer, her bruised face illuminated by the cell's dim light. "You don't get it, do you?" she whispered. "I don't need hope. I just need you to be afraid." A chill ran through Zalvotek's ridged spine. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to scoff. "Absurd. Why would I fear a powerless human?" Evelyn smiled again, but this time it wasn't defiance. It was something worse. Pity. "You'll see." Zalvotek left the cell without another word, but for the first time in his career, the fracture in the Empire. Commander Zalvotek had never felt uneasy in his own warship. The Vortex might was a fortress of steel and fire, a symbol of the Galactic Empire's absolute power. It had crushed fleets, razed cities, and carried countless prisoners to their doom. And yet, as he reviewed the latest reports, a cold unease gnawed at the edges of his mind. Evelyn Carter remained unbroken. More disturbingly, her defiance was spreading. The ripples of fear. Discipline among the crew is slipping, Officer Darvak reported, his mandibles clicking with restrained nervousness. The guards assigned to the human prisoner. They request reassignment at increasing rates. Zalvotek narrowed his eyes. On what grounds? Darvak hesitated. She unsettles them. Zalvotek's claws drummed against the metal table. This was impossible. They had held warriors, revolutionaries, warlords, beings who had led empires far older than humanity's short-lived civilization. All had broken under the empire's might. Yet this one human woman remained defiant. And worse, her defiance was infecting others. The guards whisper, "Commander," Darvak continued. "They say she knows things, that she does not need weapons or allies because she has already won." Superstitious nonsense, Zalvotek snapped. But Darvak did not look convinced. "The human slaves aboard the ship have begun to change," he admitted. "Where once they cowered, now they hold their heads higher. When ordered to kneel, they hesitate. Some refuse altogether." Zalvotek's mandibles clicked in irritation. "Increased punishments. We have." Darvak swallowed. "They do not care. They whisper her name." Zalvotek felt something rare, something he had not known since he was a young recruit standing before his own ruthless commanders. A flicker of doubt. The weight of history. That night, Zalvotek found himself in his private quarters, staring at a glowing datapad filled with records of human history. He told himself it was simple research, understanding the enemy. But as he read, his unease deepened. Time and time again, humanity had faced extinction. They had fought wars they could not win, suffered catastrophes no species should have survived. And yet they did survive. They had endured. Again and again, against impossible odds, they had refused to break. Zalvotek's claws tightened around the datapad. Fear was a universal language. It had always worked. It had broken the will of every species before humanity. But what if humans did not speak that language? What if Evelyn Carter was proof of something worse? That fear was not a constant, but a weakness the Empire had mistaken for a strength. A sudden whispering sound pulled him from his thoughts. His gaze snapped toward the corner of the room. Nothing. Only shadows. He exhaled sharply. "I'm losing focus." And yet, as he turned off the datapad, he swore he could still hear Evelyn's voice in his mind. "I just need you to be afraid." The public execution order. By the 6th day, the fractures in discipline had deepened into something dangerous. Reports arrived of minor mutinies on ships where human prisoners were kept. Imperial officers who had tortured captives were found dead in their quarters. And though no alarms had been raised, though no weapons had been fired, a whisper moved through the lower ranks. Fear had shifted sides. It was no longer the humans who were afraid. It was the Empire. The order came directly from the Emperor himself. Kill her. A public execution broadcast across the fleet and on occupied worlds. A final demonstration that resistance was futile. Zalvotek stood before his assembled officers, his posture rigid. Evelyn Carter will be executed at dawn. She will serve as an example to the others. No one cheered. No one looked relieved. Some, Zalvotek realized with a cold dread, looked uncertain. The Vortex might have carried out thousands of executions. Never had there been hesitation. This was different. Evelyn had not lifted a weapon, had not struck a single blow. Yet her presence alone had shaken the Empire's foundation. Zalvotek dismissed the officers, remaining alone in the dark command chamber. His claws curled into fists as a realization took root in his mind. They had believed that fear was control. But fear was a fire, and they had lost control of it. And Evelyn Carter? She had never been afraid of the flames. The breaking of chains. The execution chamber was silent. Hundreds of officers and soldiers stood in rigid formation, their polished armor reflecting the sterile white light of the Imperial warship. A massive viewing screen projected the scene to every ship in the fleet and onto the occupied world below. Evelyn Carter knelt at the center of the chamber, wrists bound behind her back, face bruised but unbowed. Commander Zalvotek stood above her, gripping the ceremonial execution blade. His orders were clear: strike her down, and with it, crush the ember of resistance before it could become a wildfire. But as he stared at the human woman before him, something in his grip faltered. She did not plead. She did not shake. She only watched him, and in that silence, he felt the weight of something irreversible. The spark of rebellion. The execution should have been simple. A single strike, a moment of silence, order restored. Instead, the hesitation spread like a virus. The assembled officers stood stiffly, waiting for the blade to fall, but something in Zalvotek's stance made them uneasy. They had all seen executions before. Some had carried them out themselves, but never before had a prisoner looked upon her executioner with pity. No fear, no anger, just quiet certainty. "Do it," one officer muttered under his breath. Zalvotek's fingers tightened around the blade. And yet, as he looked down at Evelyn, her words returned to him. "I don't need hope. I just need you to be afraid." And he was. Not of her, not of death. He was afraid because for the first time, he saw the Empire for what it was. Not invincible, not absolute, weak, because all it took was one woman refusing to kneel, and the whole foundation trembled. The execution chamber was filled with an unbearable silence. The tension grew heavier with every passing second. The guards holding Evelyn's arms shifted uneasily. The watching soldiers exchanged glances, uncertain. And then the moment broke. Zalvotek let the execution blade fall, not upon Evelyn's throat, upon the guard standing beside her. The alien soldier let out a strangled gasp as the blade sank into his chest. The room erupted in chaos. Before anyone could react, Evelyn moved. Her bindings had never been broken, but that hadn't stopped her. She twisted sharply, driving her shoulder into the second guard's knee, sending him sprawling. The hesitation in the room became something sharper: confusion, panic. The execution had turned into something else entirely. A mutiny. The fall of the fearless. Zalvotek turned, cutting down another officer who reached for his weapon. Around them, loyalists tried to regain control, but something was wrong. The soldiers were hesitating. Some refused to fire. Some turned on their own. And some simply stood there watching, because for the first time, they were witnessing something they had been told was impossible. A high-ranking Imperial commander fighting alongside a human. The Empire had never prepared them for this moment. And then the chamber doors burst open. A wave of human prisoners flooded in. Former slaves, former captives, now fighters. They had seen the execution broadcast and knew what it meant. They overran the guards, their shackles turned into weapons, their voices raised in a battle cry that sent a shockwave through the ranks. The Empire ruled through fear. But fear was a fragile thing, and now it was shattered. The war begins. The rebellion did not stop at the execution chamber. As alarms blared through the warship, the mutiny spread deck by deck. Enslaved humans turned on their captors, seizing control of weapons caches and docking bays. Other alien species, long subjugated by the Empire, saw their chance and joined the fight. A single woman had refused to bow, and now an entire fleet burned for it. Zalvotek led Evelyn through the chaos, cutting down enemy soldiers as they ran. "There's an auxiliary hangar ahead," he said. "We can take a shuttle." Evelyn smirked despite the blood on her face. "Leaving your own people behind." "My people," Zalvotek growled, "are the ones who fight alongside me." They reached the hangar as the ship trembled under the force of internal explosions. Fighters were launching, both Imperial loyalists and defectors engaging in frantic aerial combat. Evelyn looked back toward the corridors where the fighting still raged. "This is just the beginning," she said. Zalvotek nodded grimly. "Then we'd best make sure it's a war worth winning." With that, they boarded the shuttle, leaving behind the crumbling warship. The Vorthax's might, once a symbol of the Empire's dominance, now burned in the void. And far beyond the ship, across occupied worlds and enslaved colonies, the whispers of rebellion grew into something more. The fearless war begins. The Vorthax's might was no longer a warship. It was a graveyard. Fires raged through its decks, explosions tearing apart bulkheads as mutineers clashed with Imperial loyalists. Escape pods and shuttles shot out from the ruined vessel like embers from a dying fire, scattering across the void. The once mighty flagship of the Galactic Empire, a symbol of its unchallenged dominance, now drifted crippled and broken. And Evelyn Carter was responsible. The Empire shaken. Across the Imperial fleet, the effects of the rebellion rippled outward. Broadcasts of the execution-turned-mutiny had spread further than anyone expected. On occupied worlds, enslaved humans who had once cowered under Imperial rule stood up. Entire labor camps erupted into riots. Garrisons found themselves besieged by those they had once considered too weak to resist. Evelyn's defiance had been like a stone dropped into a still lake. And now, the waves were reaching every corner of the Empire. On the bridge of an Imperial battleship, Admiral Calvas stared in silence at the reports flooding in. "Sir," an officer whispered, voice shaking, "there are desertions. Entire battalions are laying down arms." Calvas turned slowly, mandibles clicking in disbelief. "Impossible." The officer swallowed. "Sir, they say they no longer fear us." For the first time in his long, decorated career, Admiral Calvas felt something unfamiliar settle into his bones. Doubt. The alliance of the broken. Aboard a stolen Imperial shuttle, Evelyn Carter sat in the co-pilot's seat, her hands still aching from the binds that had once held her captive. Across from her, Commander Zalvotek piloted the ship through the wreckage of the battle, his gaze hard and unreadable. "You realize what you've done," Zalvotek said. It wasn't a question. Evelyn nodded. "Yeah, I started a war." The alien commander exhaled sharply. "No, you revealed a war that had already begun. The Empire was never as strong as it wanted us to believe. You just made them realize it." A silence stretched between them. The shuttle's sensors blinked with incoming signals, distress beacons, emergency calls, and encrypted messages from other ships defecting from the Empire's ranks. They were not alone. "What now?" Zalvotek finally asked. Evelyn stared out at the vastness of space, watching the fires of rebellion ignite across the stars. "Now," she said, "we show them what happens when fear isn't a weapon anymore." Zalvotek's last stand. Not all in the Empire had hesitated. Some had doubled down. Zalvotek knew this would happen. That was why, when the Imperial dreadnought Tyrant's Blade appeared on their scanners, he was unsurprised. "They won't let us leave alive," he muttered. The dreadnought's comms flared to life. A cold, measured voice filled the cockpit. "Zalvotek, you have betrayed your people." The voice belonged to Overlord Rakshur, Zalvotek's former mentor and one of the most ruthless commanders in the Imperial fleet. "You allowed a single human to shatter your resolve," Rakshur continued. "But we can fix you. Surrender now, and you may yet be redeemed." Evelyn leaned forward. "That an offer for both of us? Or just him?" Rakshur's voice darkened. "You, human, will be erased from history." Evelyn smirked. "Well, can't say you're the first to try." Zalvotek exhaled, his decision already made. He activated the ship's thrusters, angling toward the nearest rebel signal. "We can't fight them head-on. Not yet." Rakshur's voice remained steady. "You cannot run from what you are, Zalvotek." The alien commander's grip tightened on the controls. "You're right." His gaze flicked to Evelyn. "But maybe I can choose what I become." The Tyrant's Blade opened fire. The chase had begun. The war without fear. The Empire would not fall overnight. It would fight, claw, and burn before surrendering. But for the first time in its long history, it was no longer the unstoppable force it had once believed itself to be. Because something had changed. Something more dangerous than any weapon, more powerful than any fleet. Fear no longer belonged to the Empire. And Evelyn Carter? She was just getting started. Epilogue: The Emperor's Fear. Deep within the imperial palace, the emperor sat alone in his darkened throne room. The reports before him spoke of rebellion, of worlds slipping from his grasp, of soldiers who no longer obeyed without question. But the worst part, the part that chilled him to his core, was the name that kept appearing in every intercepted transmission. Evelyn Carter. A single human woman. Not a general. Not a ruler. Just one woman who had refused to kneel. For the first time in his long reign, the emperor felt something he had never known before.